I have seen your repetitive work concerning nuclear effects and admire your work. My family was in Bamberg, Germany from December 1984 to December 1986. When Chernobyl went haywire, I felt the ground shake. I was wondering if you would know if the location we were at, Bamberg, Germany, would have suffered any fallout, and if so, what would be the health ramifications. My son was only 4 years old at the time of the Chernobyl event. Any help you could give me would be deeply appreciated, as I feel from watching your work all the time that you have much integrity and would not lead me astray from the actual truth. Thank you. Dana Durnford showed headlines of 9,000 farms closed in Scotland and the UK from Chernobyl. So if the wind blew in the right direction, there may have been exposure. Usually there are symptoms, and some at 3 Mile Island reported a metallic test in their mouth. It may have been iodine. Hope that helps. My son and I both have anemia, hypoglycemia and migraines since then. I have no clue what the long-term effects are. This paper studies the impact of long-run exposure to radiation on cognitive skills. We focus on Germany, which received a large amount of fallout after the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986, resulting in a permanent increase in radiation levels in the soil. For identification, we exploit the unequal distribution of the fallout due to idiosyncratic rainfall, and the fact that the population had no knowledge of the local level of contamination. Our results show the people who lived in a more contaminated area in 1986 performed significantly worse in standardized cognitive tests 25 years later. This effect is driven by older cohorts aged 10 to 35 in 1986, while we find no effect for people who were first exposed during early childhood. These findings suggest that radiation accelerates the decline in cognitive skills at older ages. To identify a causal effect, we exploit that the level of fallout on a region critically depended on rainfall in a 10-day window after the disaster. Places with heavy rainfall in this period received significantly more fallout than those with little rainfall. Moreover, at the time, the German population received fairly sparse information about the disaster and its consequences. Due to the sluggish release of information from the Soviet Union, people only learned about the disaster after the radioactive rain had fallen. A detailed map of radiation levels in small geographic areas was only released 5 years later, making it unlikely that people could avoid exposure by moving to a less contaminated area. We find significant negative effects of radiation exposure on cognitive skills 25 years after the disaster. A 1 standard deviation higher exposure to radiation reduces cognitive test scores 25 years later by 5% of a standard deviation. We further study whether the effect of radiation differs between demographic groups. While we find no differential effect between men and women, we find significant differences by age of first exposure. For people exposed during early childhood between 0 and 10 years of age in 1986, we find no effect, while we find strong negative effects for older cohorts. In the 2 weeks following the accident, several trillion becquerel of radioactive matter were emitted from the reactor, stirred up into the atmosphere, and, through strong east winds, carried all over Europe. The most affected countries were Belarus, Ukraine as well as the European part of Russia, although other regions, such as Scandinavia, the Balkans, Austria and Germany also received considerable amounts of nuclear fallout. The only other nuclear accident with comparable levels of fallout was the Fukushima disaster in Japan in 2011. The radioactive plume reached Germany 3 days after the disaster, on April 30, 1986. It first entered the country in the southeastern and made its way northwest before disappearing over the North Sea on May 10. A high air concentration of cesium-137 was registered on April 30, which faded after 2 days. The stations in Nuremberg close to Munich, further to the northwest, and Offenbach close to Frankfurt, in the center of the country registered a high concentration around May 2/3, whereas in Norderney, an island in the North Sea, a marginally higher concentration was only measured on May 4. The deposition of the fallout varies considerably across regions, and depends on the amount of rainfall within a critical time window. Regions that experienced heavy rainfall while the radioactive plume was hanging above Europe received large amounts of fallout, whereas regions without rainfall received very little. For affected regions, the nuclear fallout represented a long-lasting shock to radiation levels. While the air concentration of radioactive particles vanished after a few days, the ground deposition remains in the soil until today. In 2010, the first year in which we measure people's cognitive skills, more than half of the fallout was still in the ground, although, over time it has been washed out onto deeper layers of soil, thereby reducing the external exposure of the population. However, exposure through ingestion is possible until today, as certain foods, in particular mushrooms and game, still exceed radiation limits in parts of South Germany. Radiation exposure affects the human body through ionization, a process that damages the DNA and can lead to the dysfunction or death of cells. Radiation can directly damage the DNA in a cell when it collides and reacts with the DNA, or indirectly damage the DNA when it ionizes water molecules in the cell. Overall, these results suggest that continuous exposure to radiation over 25 years decreased people's cognitive skills, and that these negative estimates are statistically significantly different from zero. These results point to a high economic significance of the impact of radiation on cognitive skills. We find no difference in estimates between men and women. While we find large negative effects for people aged 10 years and older in 1986, we find no effect on people who were younger than 10 years. We assess if the effects differ between people who, in 1986, lived in the GDR versus West Germany. Unlike in West Germany, the population in the GDR received little information about the disaster and its likely consequences, and was even encouraged to consume foods that were potentially contaminated. Given these differences, it is not surprising that the estimated effect in the GDR, although not statistically significant, is more than twice as large as the one for West Germany. In this paper, we use geographic variation in radioactive ground contamination to explore how exposure to subclinical levels of radiation negatively affects people's cognitive skills. Focusing on Germany, we show that people who lived in areas that received high levels of radioactive rainfall immediately after the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986 performed significantly worse in cognitive tests more than 25 years later.
So first let's hit Chernobyl. I was fooling around yesterday and decided to make a map of some of the fallout. UK sheep meat restrictions after Chernobyl. UK, Ireland, Scotland, actually, and UK. They closed 9,000 farms. That's 3,000 miles away from Chernobyl. So they didn't tell you that in HBO Chernobyl series, right? Transfer the milk in Austrian, Alpine, agricultural, strontium and everything else. The most contaminated territories, and there was many of them, by the way. You're talking about kilobecquerels, and a kilobecquerel square meters, a kilobecquerel is 1,000. So 31,000 atomic decays per second in Austria. It's highlighted in the gray for you, and we just got a few of them to get through. And so, but the radiation didn't just, because we're talking about way up here was where Russia was. We're talking about United Kingdom with 9,000 farms closed, and Austria is way over here. So you can see Chernobyl is not just isolated to 30 miles around Chernobyl, which is what the entire media wants you to believe. A partial adjustment model in Greece, how goats in Greece, should pay attention to the milk rather than meat because of the radiation. Because people don't eat the meat till way down the road, but the milk is every day, see? Impact of Chernobyl accident on freshwater ecosystem in Italy. So it wasn't just, and so we got Italy highlighted and Austria highlighted for you. And I didn't highlight Greece in that one. My apologies. We'll get to that. Intake of lactating mothers with Italian data after Chernobyl. Down syndrome in Belarus. Down syndrome, time clustering. Think about that, those connotations. So Austria, Italy, Croatia, and airborne in Norway, and ground level measurements for validation on top of that. And of course, Norway's way over here. Remember, they closed 9,000 farms in Ireland, Scotland, UK. I gotta fix that, have I? Not sure if I can. Let's keep going. Suicide risk among Chernobyl cleanup workers. Why would he do a study on suicide risks among cleanup workers? Well, because of the contamination. Their kidneys, they were centered on the roof. Some of these, several, 25,000 or something, went out on the roof of the reactor to throw the fuel off the roof. And so you went out there for 15 to 25 seconds, and that was all the work you done there, and then they sent you home where you got sick and died later. That's crazy numbers, right? But what happens is your organs are starting to melt. So they send you home, and then you get sick that night and for the rest of your life. Mushrooms and game in Poland, highly radioactive. So you got Italy, Croatia, Austria, Poland. The better radioactivity milk in Spain, we're talking about strontiums and cesiums and technetium-99 in Spain. So you got Spain over here, and Italy, and Croatia, and Austria, and Poland. Don't forget Ireland, Scotland, UK, and Norway that I showed you earlier. You got disposition over France 16 years after. Think about France and Spain and Italy and Croatia and Austria and Poland. Don't forget Ireland, Scotland, UK, and Norway. Germany, of course. Don't forget Germany. We got Germany and Poland, France and Spain and Italy and Austria and Croatia and UK, Norway. Fresh lakes in the UK. It wasn't just the farms. They should have abandoned UK, Ireland and Scotland and Spain and Germany and Poland and France and Italy and Croatia and Norway, of course, everywhere else. You get what's going on here. Because a single particle can make you sick. It can give you cancer, and cancer is late in the last one to show up. So there we included the United Kingdom in the gray zones. It's very sobering when you really, if you're being honest and you look at it honestly, right? Then nuclear power is a plague. The atomic plague is actually real. Atmospheric dispersal and disposition. So it wasn't just segregated and isolated to these countries. This is a model. I'll bring it up on the big screen for you, on a big shot screen. This is the plume leaving Chernobyl. And there's only 14 hours, 19 hours, 20 hours. So one day later, by day 2, you can see it. Just because it moves past these countries meant the countries were blanketed. Just because the plume didn't stay hovering on the country, it doesn't mean the countries and the oceans and the estuaries and lakes and rivers and the territories didn't get radiated. This shows you the plume path. Everything gets covered. You only have to be covered once. You get what's going on. So it never just covered those little areas I'm showing you. There's I produced 2 studies for the anniversary where I cover 700 plus studies about Chernobyl you've never seen before or heard tell of before. Extremely important if you're interested in this stuff. It really brings the whole thing to go. Let me give you a sample of some of that. In Poland, and I'm going to bring up some pictures between some of these. This is Chernobyl picture. Swedish municipalities fallout, external radiation exposure. External. You can't have external without having an internal. You can't have external without going home and putting your laundry with your other laundry, your bedding, your pillow casing, your pajamas, your children's clothing, and washing it and contaminating everything. And then you can't have external doses without contaminating your lakes, your rivers, your estuaries, your aquifers, and your crops, and your food, your air. Do you get to the deception of such a study? To the arrogance of calling external. This is one of the 600 pilots that died. They died right away. You won't see that at the UN or UNSCLEAR or ERPA, ICRP websites. 600 pilots died, helicopter pilots. Airborne radio surveys of Chernobyl in Norway using ground level. We showed you that. These people were going on the roof. Their job was to go work for 25 seconds, and then they went home. And that's because they were getting brutal doses. Pre and post Chernobyl in the Baltic, the southern Baltic brown seaweed. You can't have it in just brown seaweed. All 600 helicopter pilots died. In the Black Sea, in Turkey, these people were out there for 25 seconds, folks. Incredible doses that are not put into the official tallies. The industry has a death wish for everybody, not just Oxford. Model assessment of additional contamination of water bodies as a result of wildfires. So fires in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, because the radiation killed all the bacteria in the forest doesn't break down. And so when you have lightning strikes and stuff happening, these wildfires there, you're liberating it incredible amounts into the environment again. And just think about the victims. They were jacking people off the streets with buses at Chernobyl. Like, they got graveyards and graveyards and graveyards of equipment. Some of these helicopters were brand new and only used 3 times. And then they were abandoned. Same as these vehicles, just used 1 or 2 times, then they're abandoned. Radiocesium contamination of beef in Croatia after Chernobyl. Chernobyl radioactivity persists in the reindeer long after it. You abandon all of these communities and infrastructures in the Black Sea ecosystem. So they're spraying regions, right? So they can send in the homeless and the destitute again. Acute kidney injuries after Chernobyl. All these, they didn't abandon all of this for something to do, see? Cancer of the stomachs and kidneys. You ran away and left your communities behind, just like Fukushima. Lebanese soil a decade after Chernobyl. So you don't abandon everything for something to do. And then to have Homer Simpson, happy Homer Simpson, which was used to indoctrinate your children also with Spider-Man and the rest of them and the Hulk. Chernobyl fallout, prenatal mortality in England and Wales, where they closed 9,000 farms. They should have just abandoned those countries like they did this here. Because that's how bad radiation is. It's not that I hate radiation or hate nuclear, but for something to do, it's a danger. It's a threat to all 8 million species. See? Transfer of plutonium isotopes, strontium, to birds and bats and ground-dwelling mammals, because there's what they call a ground shine. Because the atoms are pulsing at the speed of light, they hit each other and change direction at the speed of light. It's the Bromson-Lung, probably fudging the word, effect, which creates a gamma shine X-rays on the ground. They call it a ground shine. It's insidious. And so all the fauna and the flora and the insects and the bacteria, the bases of the food chain, is eviscerated. Here's another one for you. This is something that we've seen in many countries. Sex odds at birth in Europe and the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. So after a nuclear accident or around nuclear power plants, there's more males than females. And then the females, they lose their, because they're born with all their eggs, including the animal kingdoms, not just humans, see? This would have been true in the animal kingdom too. You would have been seen an odd, in a sex odd at birth. Chernobyl, the invisible thief. Here's one of them here. Her name is Geraldine Thomas. She actually, all of her videos at BBC have been taken down, I noticed. I came across a story where she came out in a meeting and said, we gotta attack the anti-nuclear. We gotta go to war against the anti-nuclear movement. It's not really a very big anti-nuclear movement. There's nobody on the planet doing what I'm doing, for starters, an educational program. And the majority of the sites out there, they hide away. There's very few people actually shows their faces. It's extremely unusual. Chernobyl cover-up. By the way, the last two on that. 3% of the children born or exposed to Chernobyl radiation while they were still in their mothers were diagnosed as healthy at the age of 7. Only 3%. Over 3 million children require treatment. If you require treatment from radiation exposure, it's permanent. It's for the rest of your life. And it gets worse, see? It's in increments over time.